Be here now. Just be here now.
Welcome to the Set and Setting podcast with Madison Margolin. As a journalist, Madison has spent years exploring the intersection of psychedelics, cannabis, and culture. This podcast brings together thought leaders from today's psychedelic renaissance to talk about the role of psychedelics in our inner and outer lives. You can support this podcast and find additional resources at BeHereNowNetwork.com/Madison.
Hi, everyone. I'm Madison Margolin. Welcome back to the Set and Setting podcast. Our guest today is Donnell Alexander. He's a journalistic storyteller based in Los Angeles and a fellow at the University of Southern California's Center for Health Journalism, where he's reporting on fairness in cannabis. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. Really happy to be here.
Yeah, me too. I love your work. And, one thing that I just read in your bio when it says fairness in cannabis, can you just kind of say what that means? Just to jump right into the meat of the conversation here.
Sure. You and I, because of the work we do, we tend to be in this cannabis bubble. And I realize that most of the country is nowhere near that. Even consumers, never mind the infrastructure of government and all that. People just don't know it. And I wanted to talk in terms of fairness rather than this term social equity, which is like ubiquitous around cannabis right now. And so I wrote about social equity in a general sense, but I also brought in expungement to the equation because you really can't separate the two. I've learned a lot about that. And the piece should be out fairly. It's actually a series of articles. It's 3 of them. And I think I just wanted to have like a sort of 50,000 foot perspective on it where everyone could see it rather than our own local version of fairness or equity in cannabis.
And just for the audience, expungement meaning like when someone is, you want to explain it to people.
Records, when you're arrested for cannabis, you have a record. And there was a movement that came along with legalization to expunge, remove these records, clear these records of these hundreds of thousands of people. I think we had 1 million people who have been convicted of cannabis use, and it's a great thing that's happening. But one of the things I've learned is without a broader sort of holistic view at being fair, expungement in itself doesn't do a whole bunch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to get into kind of like how you see the cannabis industry going and how to create kind of a fair system. But first of all, I want to know, how did you get into cannabis in general? Like, why is this your thing?
I was a religious kid. That's something we'll talk more about later. But I started smoking cannabis when I was 12. I don't even have to say that was way too young. Maybe it wasn't, but I think it was too young. It's probably too young for most people. And almost instantaneously, I realized my understanding of religion. I was a Jehovah's Witness. It was a very specific religion. It ended by the time I'd exhaled. I said, this is not what we're doing anymore. And I was definitely doing something related to cannabis, a sort of searching journey, but I didn't know what that was. But by the time I grew up, I knew what it was. And I knew it was an extension of the Jehovah's Witness thing. I wrote a memoir that came out in 2003. And one of the chapters is called Jehovah's Witness for Life, because you never really stop. I never really stopped. I just found more useful application for that in my spiritual journey.
Wow. So being a Jehovah's Witness for life, like what does that look like? What is the evolution of your relationship to Jehovah's Witness?
Sure. I'm not one anymore. And what I should say is that it's an evangelical form of Christianity. So you're not just keeping it to yourself. It's very different from, I think, Catholicism and probably Judaism. I don't know if that's fair to say. You're not evangelical faith?
No, I don't know. I mean, I guess I know some people who are evangelical in their approach to their religion, but I wouldn't say it's specifically evangelical.
Yeah. So, I think I go around kind of proselytizing. I'm not proselytizing about Jehovah. I definitely, these last few years, have been proselytizing about pot, but I was a music critic before that. And you're just preaching about bands, and I just tried to find a utility for it. I always had like a, kind of seriousness to go with my curiosity. Mm-hmm. And it's, I'll just tell you, when I started smoking pot in 7th grade, I wrote an essay on it for my English teacher. I didn't use my name. I just wrote an essay on pot. And I studied all the books I could get into at the library, and probably aroused the suspicion of a lot of people. But yeah, it never really stopped. It's a way to be different without really changing. I don't think I've like changed my core mission of who I am in life or who I was in adolescent. That's probably why I'm a divorced person right now.
Right. Wait, so you started smoking cannabis in 7th grade?
Yeah.
Wow. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Ohio. I grew up in a town on Lake Erie called Sandusky, Ohio. It's a town that has like the biggest amusement park in the Midwest. And I basically grew up in the shadow of an amusement park. And I just like, the whole thing about, excuse me, cannabis was also followed by an interest in LSD, but I didn't actually have access to LSD. My great joke, you can tell me if it's a great joke. The hardest thing about being a 12-year-old pot user is finding people to sell it to you.
Right. Where do you, how do you, I mean, I figure the kids have their ways, but what was it like kind of, growing up in the shadow of this amusement park, being 12 years old, trying to get your hands on some weed?
Yeah, no, I actually am writing about it in one of my side projects with the USC fellowship, but one of my good friends was a paper boy, and he had a route. It was like the most ingenious way of being a teenage drug dealer, is to be the paper boy. He, some houses he got money for the paper, some houses he got money for weed, and he just treated us that whole 7th grade year. The first half of 7th grade year, I moved in the middle of it. I listened to him, but I don't think it was the best thing in my life for me, but it did make me understand that I wanted to be bigger than this town that I was in. It's like 30,000 people and pretty industrial once you get away from the amusement park. And I knew there was like a journey. Jumped on a plane when I was 18, like my first plane, and it's just been tripping ever since. Life is different every day. And a lot of it I owe to cannabis, to be really honest with you.
And why do you say that?
Well, it opened up a door. I barely graduated from high school. I had a 1.45 GPA, and I just wasn't interested in being taught the way that I read hella books. I just was interested in what I was interested in. And because I took that tact, I was very much guided toward working at the factories that was in town. There was no way I was going to work at the factories. I'd be like a lot of my friends I grew up with, dead or in jail, if I'd gone toward that unsatisfactory career path. And I invested in this idea that I was going to writing didn't come immediately, but I had these narratives I was interested in my head, and a way of following the world that was interested in my head that, just wasn't going to be satisfied by me being in Ohio. So I flew to California when I was 18, and Sacramento, and, that was like the coolest place in the world as far as I was concerned. I tell people my birthday began when I turned 18,
You told people your
everything
birthday
else was
again?
like a prequel.
Wow. And why is that? Wait, so why did you end up in Sacramento now? I'm just so fascinated by your life story here.
My grandfather had moved out here, and I had an aunt, and they put me up. I was just talking to my girlfriend about this. Like when I came here, I was super. I hadn't been anywhere. I lived in Ann Arbor for a year, but the first week in town, I saw Dr. Dre's original group, the World Class Wrecking Crew, perform. And I was already like a super hip hop fanatic. My friends were DJs growing up in high school. And so that was in my life. The weed was so much better than the weed in Ohio. And more importantly, because I was a poor person, community college was $50 a semester, So I became editor of my community college newspaper. I worked at the Daily when I was 19 as a sports writer. And, I've been taking care of myself as a writer ever since. The main, divergence from any sort of mainstream path is that after college, I was supposed to take a job at the Seattle Times, and that Bush administration, what's it called? The economy had it tanked after the Gulf War. And so my internship, I had a 3-year gig at the Seattle Times that went away, and I had to start working for alternative papers. That was a place where I could actually be myself in print. In large part, I won't say large part, but in part because I could be an open cannabis smoker and no one was giving me shit. I'd worked at the LA Times and the Boston Globe when I was in school, and I would never have dreamed of being out of the closet about my pot use. People smoked, but they did it on the low, and that freedom I received as a writer in Chico and then in San Francisco and eventually LA Weekly, it just, if you're 25 to 32, if you were that way, 25 to 32 in the 90s, you definitely had to keep it on the low. Mm-hmm. I'm very happy for everyone who gets to openly smoke pot in the 2021 era. But I'm glad I went through it. I have some reputational issues because of it, but I'm glad I went through it.
And so, okay, so you said you did music journalism and then you sort of transitioned into like doing cannabis journalism, or?
Not exactly. It's all sort of haphazard and not, but like I said, I started working in Chico and San Francisco. LA Weekly hired me to cover the OJ trial. That's how I got to LA.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. They didn't have any Black people on staff. I was here, and so I was there. So they brought me in, and it was great. But ESPN called me out of nowhere. And that's how I moved to New York. I took a gig at ESPN's magazine and, worked at 34th and Madison. Mm-hmm. It was a difficult time. I wrote a book about it. I wrote about corporate media, and I got myself blackballed. That's all you can say. It was black. My career as a sports writer was over. I still did music journalism. And what's important here is that I wrote a book about the experience, and, that was... My career has been different ever since. Not worse, but very, very different. Mm-hmm. Cannabis didn't come until, I think I did my first thing in 2010. You may be familiar. I think the Doc Ellis thing. And Doc Ellis,
yes.
For people who don't know it, maybe you can explain it.
Well, for people who don't know the story, this is a legend about Doc Ellis, right? I should know. What team was he on?
You don't have to know that. It's the Pittsburgh Pirates.
Okay, he was on the Pittsburgh Pirates, and he threw a one-hitter. What was that?
This is before the 70s. This is 1970, so it's before your time, of course.
Yeah, before my time. But I have a lot of baseball fans in my life, Mets fans, and Doc Ellis threw a one-hitter, which is someone who doesn't speak baseball apparently is a really big thing, and he was on acid while he did it. Yeah. Did I say the story correctly?
The only thing that's better than a one-hitter is a no-hitter, and that's what he threw.
Oh, a no-hitter.
It's very it's funny in that he was on acid. He threw one of the craziest no-hitters ever. He had like 7 walks, runners on base, but he was unhittable. And he told me the story from the comfort of his living room in Apple Valley, California. It became it's one of my favorite career moments and it was a public radio piece, and it was a driveway moment. People told me they just sat in their cars and waited for it to finish. And it became a couple years later, this animated short that people really got into. And then a documentary film about Doc Ellis. So why did we get on the Doc Ellis thing?
I think we were talking about how your relationship to journalism changed. You were a sports writer. Yeah.
Right. I was just knocking about for a lot. And that one actually made such a difference in my career because I got to Sundance where we got an honorable mention and I got to make some films after that. And, it takes a while to get to the part where I'm working as a cannabis journalist. But the most important thing is I moved to Portland during the tumult of my career. Legalization really helped shape me as a journalist writing about pot, but more importantly, adjusting my dosage so I could be a much more functional person in society. And that's the stuff that I think is getting to the stuff in the podcast we want to talk about.
Yeah. So, I wanted to understand, you've been so influenced by cannabis, right? Not just as someone who's creating media around cannabis, but, you're saying since you're 12 years old, basically, you've had a relationship with this plant. And you mentioned also psychedelics too, right? So what have been your formative experiences vis-a-vis these altered states, and how has that kind of set you on this path?
Yeah. Let me start with the psychedelics just because I think that in terms of changing who I am, that one has been most important. I think of cannabis as helping me get deeper into who I am because the world always tells you something other than what's actually going on with you. The hallucinogenics changed me. And I was very lucky enough to, in college in Fresno, have a mentor. I should explain because Fresno's not like the hipness capital of the world for anyone who doesn't live here. But I had done an internship at the Fresno Bee, and there was a photographer, son of Jamaican parents from Oakland named Lloyd Francis. And he mentored me. And that's the thing, like there aren't a ton, or historically there haven't been a ton of Black people in cannabis. I'm sorry, there have been a shitload of Black people in cannabis, Black people in acid, you know? I think the drug war really did a number on any kind of interest that might have come about in the 60s and 70s. And, you know, when I was growing up, saying acid was like saying you're going to put literal acid in your body. It was just so little understanding. And I was lucky enough to have this mentor, and he never let me take acid that wasn't good, which in hindsight, I never appreciated it in the moment. I was like, why can't I take that? Why can I take that? But in hindsight, I go, God, that's probably the best thing he did for me.
Wow.
And on my first real significant trip, my first trip, I saw Prince. I did this in Ohio before I left, like 3 days before I jumped on that plane. I went on the Purple Rain tour, took acid, thought Prince was amazing, didn't think the acid had worked. I just thought Prince was that amazing. It didn't take till the second time I saw Prince, and he was very good, but it wasn't like the first time. It was like, oh shit, I was totally high, you know? And, but one of the first real trips was with Lloyd, and he took me to a friend's place where I did that thing you're not supposed to do of looking in the mirror. I don't know how you feel about that as a thing that you do, but I had just listened to this Richard Pryor bit, and I don't want to trigger your audience, but it's called Bicentennial Nigger. And if you can find it, it's still amazing to this day. It uses this narrative of coming over on the slave ships to talk about how you have to have a sense of humor about this life, this condition, this, let's just call it a condition. And it got to me so deeply. And it ends with him saying, y'all probably, it came out in 1976. And he says at the end, y'all probably thought about all that shit, you know, all these past transgressions. And he goes, but I ain't never going to forget it. And the way he said it, in the place where I was, it just basically branded itself on me. And, you know, I'm not an angry person, in part because I think cannabis kept me happy. But this was a college thing where I decided, well, that's what I'm going to do with my writing. You know, it was that and Lou Reed that made me think, this is what I'm going to do as a writer. I'm going to sell real shit and never let people forget that this thing has happened. You have to remember, again, this is 1987 or 88. And we're in the heart of the Reagan administration, and nobody's talking about this stuff. If they saw TV and the commercials and Netflix, what it's on now, that America would have shat its collective pants. I'm telling you. So, you know, the ability to talk about that stuff and interest in it definitely, you're laughing now. I've done things to hurt my career in the name of following that agenda that are just something we should talk about some night over a joint.
Right. Wow. So go on. So finish.
I'm just saying that the acid thing changed me. I've never done a lot. I've maybe tripped 30 times in my life on LSD. You can talk about other hallucinogens some other time, but I'm careful and thoughtful. And it's important to me, even when it's not ubiquitous.
And so, you know, based on like your experience of acid when you first tried it, you know, with your mentor and whatever, and versus like where we are now in the psychedelic space, like, what do you make of that? Like, is the environment, is the cultural moment in psychedelics what you would have thought it could be or what you hoped it could be? Especially seeing, and we can talk about this as well, like a lot of the disappointment, honestly, in the letdown of the cannabis industry, just, you know, all this hope of legalization. And now we're in a legal paradigm and it, you know, it's just not, it sucks, for lack of a better word. So yeah, I'll let you riff on that.
I'm always careful to say that it sucks for people in the industry. For the consumers, it's amazing. So there's that thing, you know. Jimmy Carter was president when I started getting high. They didn't have any edibles.
Right.
But having said that, the naked greed at the top of cannabis is beyond disconcerting. You know, not only am I here in California for my reporting on fairness, I went to Oregon, and you know, they practically give you weed when you leave. It's so cheap, and you see people there struggling. They struggle differently from the way we struggle here, I think. Why do you think that is? You've been around the block. Why do you think they're not as upset about this as we are?
In Oregon?
Yeah.
You know, first of all, Oregon is like, their population is just so much different than California. You know, like California has a really diverse market. You have a Northern California outdoor kind of like off the back to the landers, off the gridders or whatever, who really like were cultivating the culture of cannabis. Then you have like the SoCal, stoner punks. And then you have, first of all, California is just so much more of a diverse state. Like you have so many people just like getting busted for weed. Especially like people of color, whatever, like 3 or 4 times the rate of white people, despite like comparable rates of use. And I think Oregon just does not have that diversity of cannabis culture. And so therefore, like there's less to be mad about because there's fewer people getting uniquely screwed over. Whereas here in California, how do I say this? Like, there's more people who have been invested in the cannabis space and therefore are not have more to lose or who are not now able to participate in a way that is, righting the wrongs of the past. I mean, I don't know. That's my take on it. Like why people in California are just like upset about it. I mean, it's just not fair. And I want to talk to you about it. Like, it's just not a fair industry, and people are like paying lip service to like social equity, and they'll set up cannabis companies where like 51% of it or something is like owned by someone of color, and then the rest of the 49% is like owned by investors who are going to like go and take it over anyways, and it's not really creating intergenerational wealth or like righting the wrongs of the drug war. In California, just has like been, the communities here have been so much more ravaged by the drug war, just by virtue of like the size of the state and the diversity of the state. Whereas like Oregon, like doesn't have that level of diversity at all, I would say. Yeah. What do you think?
I also don't think number one, I don't think the market here in LA is as diverse as the basic consumers by any stretch, and certainly it's wider than the illicit market, Mm-hmm. But no, I think you're right. I think though that one of the differences, the big difference I was bringing it up for, is that people are leveraged here so much more. The expectations are so much higher. I feel like there's much more pressure. It's easy to be poor in places where you never really had that much money. I don't know what the investment schemes are for these companies that I know in Oregon, but there seems less pressure on them than the entrepreneurs I talk to here.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, it might also be like just a different, I mean, I don't know like what the tax system is like in Oregon or whatever.
Oh,
but like
it's lower than, this is outrageous. Yeah.
Right. So it's just like a whole different political political paradigm that people are up against. And, combine that then with cannabis, like it's just, they're dealing with different lifestyle issues, I would say.
Right. And that's one of the reasons, I putting together this series, I compared it to powerlifting, because it's just such a heavy lift trying to talk about America when every condition is so distinct, and even from county to county, it changes.
So just out of curiosity, like based on, your having been inspired by sort of the spirit of cannabis or the spirit of different psychedelic substances, like what do you see as, like what would a fair system look like in regard to cannabis or psychedelics? Like in an ideal world, we can say.
This is what I'm getting at in my series. It's a hard sell in an environment where taxes are so high and everything seems set up in favor of the MSOs, the multi-state operators. But I do think there needs to be a fund that actively pays for people to get into the business, not just training, but actually access to funds. There are all these, I read so many articles. I've read literally hundreds of articles that all could be boiled down to access to funds. And, Alex Halpern, the old co-host at Weed Week podcast in which you appeared, he just would always say capitalism doesn't behave like that in terms of how we're aspiring to social equity. And, I'm not the person to sell it, but I really do think there needs to be a required fund for what you're giving to the stuff. Without spoiling things, but I've been writing about Florida, a place where social equity is like a foreign word. They don't talk about it. And there's one company that has half of the weed down there, Trulieve. And the fact of the matter is, even in our conversations about talking about this, they did not want to talk about it. I knocked my request down from an on-the-phone interview to a Q&A, and she wouldn't even do that. The CEO of that company, and I'm saying it right here, she wouldn't do that. She sent me a statement that was clearly cut and pasted from somewhere else because she doesn't have to. I think there are a lot of people who won't do anything until pushed. And part of the reason I'm writing this piece is I am pushing you. I have never had the resources of USC. I'll tell you something about USC. I complained about having trouble with this data set, and they had someone from the LA Times, their data reporter specialist, right there to do my work for me. If I had that all the time, I'd do amazing work. This is my one shot, so I'm telling medical marijuana companies, pay up, you owe us.
Wow. So so keeping people accountable also is you're saying somewhat impossible in certain scenarios until they're really pushed to a point where they have to. So what is that breaking point,
Well, one of the things that Alex got across to me is that there are studies, maybe you've seen them, that show that cannabis consumers care more about where their product comes from, the conditions behind them receiving them, more than almost any other group of consumers. And we haven't really tried making this an issue. Every activist, every regulator I've talked about who's tried to bring about fairness talks about a disconnect between them and the companies. Lip service is okay. And when I undertook this assignment, I want lip service to not be okay anymore. We can't make every white male in America want to do what they're supposed to. But if everyone knows their obligation, social, moral, then they'll contend with that, and we'll see how it works out.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, there's this age-old question, right? Do you have to smoke weed to be in the cannabis industry, or do you have to have your own, psychedelic experiences to be in the psychedelic space? And, it's not like anyone's holding anyone to that standard. But my question is do you think that the ethos of the psychedelic experience, of the cannabis experience, engenders just a different approach to the way you do business or economics or anything like that? If we were really integrating the values that you come to under the influence of substance X, whatever that might be, would that be reflected then in the way the whole cultural and industry space plays out?
It's a good question. One of the things I came across in reporting this summer is the volume at which cannabis works as barter, and I'm a big fan of the barter system in general. I think I'd love to see that happen, even if it's an ancillary aspect of the industry's growth. I obviously don't think that's primarily going to be the thrust of what makes cannabis happen, but just retaining that and spreading it. That's one of the best things about cannabis. It spreads useful stuff, spreads love. That's what they say. And I think that could be a part of it. But generally speaking, I think capitalism is going to be capitalism. And as long as we have not just a dysfunctional federal government, but some of these state governments are not that much better. As long as we have that level of dysfunction, I don't think we're going to have any innovative things happening in commercial cannabis.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess I would count also the home grow rules. I don't know what they're like. They vary from state to state too, but they seem like they could have an impact on how business is done.
Well, one thing that kind of gives me hope for the future of the cannabis space, the psychedelic space, is, this concept of mysticism and the relationship between these substances and more spiritual states. So, you think the way the policy plays out with, you have adult use or recreational and you have medical. And so you think there's this binary of the way that you can use cannabis or, anything really. And, you learn or you see through cultures such as Rastafarianism, for instance, where cannabis is a sacrament, you see that there is a third way that, I'd like to say that at best kind of transcends, conversations about market share or whatever. Is when you're talking about a sacrament, it's sort of weird to talk about that in the same conversation as something that you're commercializing. And so yeah, I kind of wanted to get at do coming from Jehovah's Witness background, like how does that relate to a spiritual experience through cannabis or psychedelics or, some other sort of mindfulness type practice?
Yeah. I was thinking about your question, and the pen is mightier than the sword. The thing about Jehovah's Witnesses is that they were formed in the wake, in the run up to World War I. They're sort of a pacifist organization, and I feel very strong in terms of my ability to write this thing that's really not ability, inclination to work toward being a good writer, and innate curiosity. I tend to think of that as something I've been building on with weed, just always. And I feel like I get to shift people. I am in the cannabis industry in an ancillary way, even if it's like if I'm the referee or something. I feel like that is taking my spiritual impulse and applying it, because I did a story last year about Black farmers, not cannabis farmers, but farmers who I'm not. Are you familiar with the Pickford decision?
No, not really.
I didn't even know about it either, but it's this historic decision that happened, maybe 15 years ago, 10 years ago, in which it was decided that the USDA had historically discriminated against Black farmers. In 1920, 20% of farmers were Black. Now it's 1% or something. So they agreed to give billions of dollars to these Black farmers, and it was hung up forever. I did the story last year. And this is actually very specific to cannabis. I wrote this piece last year for The Guardian. I have never been more stoned for a sustained period of time in my life. And I turned in the draft, not as journalism, but as a piece of literature. And I knew there was no way they were running it. And I did it through the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, an organization based in New York. And the fact is that there were sentences in it. There were 2 to 3 sentences in it. I knew that they were presented properly and contextualized right, could change people's minds, rock their worlds. I'm always trying to rock their worlds. If I can rock someone's world like once an article, I'm totally good. But this had 3 of them, so I was super amped.
Wow, I want to read this article.
Yeah, well, here's the thing, though. The point of your answering your question, it came out. Someone who'd gone to my community college before me, because I'm a community college legend, he saw that the Biden administration's one of his advisors said that they were going to make the plight of Black farmers an agenda item, and they gave billions to these people, like first at the immediate part of his administration. And I know I had something to do with that. So
they made good on it. Finally.
Well, not the whole thing. It's being fought. You can imagine that traditional white farmers are fighting the shit out of it, but the funding's been, loosened. And that definitely helped people. It actually plays a role in the series that I'm writing right now too, the Cannabis series, because none of these things are ever isolated. When you're dealing with racism or white supremacy, the interconnectedness is pretty consistent.
So what role does it play in the Cannabis series that you're working on?
Well, when are you coming out? It probably will have been out by.
Okay, I see.
Been out by the time you come. You're
the podcast.
I can tell you that Florida, which has no Black people growing weed, is going to give 1 license to a Black farmer, and they're going to give it to someone who is listed under this Pickford arrangement. It was a class action suit. One of the litigants will probably get the next license in Florida. Okay. And it's weird because I'm not getting into this in the story, but just to go back to your question, none of these people who are eligible have grown weed before. They'll contract out the weed, but that tradition you're speaking of, it's not there, And on the other side, these people are in their church, they're changing their mind about cannabis. They're examining it and going to these classes at Florida A&M University because it's a viable alternative to the opioid crisis. Mm-hmm. So, we have our traditions and our expectations and our mystical aspirations, but I think sometimes things diverge in ways that are unexpected, and we got to be able to roll with them.
So I have a question, because you mentioned like people are talking about in church, and this past spring, I co-produced this Jewish psychedelic summit, and a lot of the Jewish world you can get away with having these conversations more than one might think, right? Like there's not been a lot of opposition at all to talking about cannabis and psychedelics in religious contexts. And so I was curious, I don't know how connected you are anymore to the world of Jehovah's Witness, but like in, in Christianity or in the religious circles that you might be familiar with, like what is the relationship to psychedelics and cannabis or altered states? Like are people talking about it differently than maybe when you were a kid?
Sure. I've heard in Oakland of stories about, what are they called? Pastors addressing their conversations about it, bringing it into church. And, I have a real issue with, I hate to leave it to the Black community, but the Black community's prohibition has been sometimes stronger than white people's when you get to the church people. And it's an understandable reaction, to how the drug war has impacted people, and you just don't want to get in trouble. But that happening means a lot to me. It does. I don't think many people ever would have done it if it wasn't for the opioid crisis becoming such a big deal. Mm-hmm. But I do feel like it's been there under the table forever. If you go back to the Comedy Friday, which I have to say, I reviewed Friday for LA Weekly. I was the only black critic in the country to review it, period. But I was the only critic to give it a positive review. You can go back. It was the only one. But in that movie, Bernie Mac plays a minister who's, he's sleeping around on the slide, but he sees the weed and he's trying to cop the weed on the low. And I feel like a lot of that Bernie Mac character exists out there,
Yeah. Yeah. So you're saying like, it's still stigmatized though.
But it's diminished. I mean, to me, it's corollary to how the country's attitudes about queer people has changed. Mm-hmm. It's happened so fast. And maybe, the feelings are always in there, but the barrier to participation and approval is legalization for a lot of people.
Right.
And, but spiritually, I think the plant's super strong. Clearly, this experience in our professional lives, dealing with the exploitive entrepreneurs, whatever you want to call them, we see that like cannabis isn't supernatural. It can be abused by anyone.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the whole thing is like, we're here on the Be Here Now network. I'm sure a lot of the audience is interested in mindfulness. And there are ways to use cannabis mindfully. And I think there are ways that you can use cannabis non-mindfully. And it's just a matter of intention or just your relationship to the plant or whatever. So like, do you have like a specific practice around using cannabis, or is it just like when you feel like it, or, like how does cannabis kind of inform your own kind of like flow state or spiritual practice or just ability to quote unquote, like be here now?
I would compartmentalize it. In terms of my writing, I really try to not smoke an hour before I write. I just have a sweet spot of my consciousness where it's on the downside of the high. When it's starting to sort of fade, that's when I'm the most together and still dialed into the truth, if you want to call it that. And then at the gym, it's a huge part of my gym life. I was like 60 pounds heavier in Oregon, and I started using it at the gym. And the level of engagement that I was able to have and the intensity of my relationship with my body, my ability to communicate with my body was so much more mine that, I would honestly say that my favorite time to consume is at the gym. I will be honest with you, I will, if it's organic, I will, but I do use the energy drinks to kind of boost this journey, and the way that my heart and the drug and my brain all interact is, I don't get that anyplace else in the world. And I'd probably be really fat if I didn't have it. What about you? What's your practice like?
Yeah, honestly, I feel like people think I smoke weed way more than I do. I love spliffs. I dated a spliff smoker, and so he got me into it. And now I'm like such a snob. Like I'm like, if it's not a spliff, I don't even know if I want it. I think because I don't have the highest tolerance, and so a spliff really, for those in the audience, it's like part tobacco, part cannabis. You get a little bit. It's just less intense, I'd say, than a joint. And I don't smoke tobacco. Like I don't smoke cigarettes or anything like that. This is just a spliff, and it's usually just social, like on the weekends, essentially, or at night. I don't like smoking in the daytime at all. It makes me way too tired. And yeah, I'd say like, I've also really practiced, cannabis. I mean, the way you're talking about the gym, like that for me has like been a thing, like smoke weed and dance, or smoke weed and like do something active, or just kind of like don't like, I'd rather be like active in doing something than sitting and like pontificating and like dwelling in my thoughts, because that's definitely something that could happen to me.
Well, I have to tell you, that's my thing, is that I've been terrorized by my thoughts. I was a kid with a lot of anxiety and just making things slow down. And yeah, I'll just be honest with you. Can I say this? I don't know if I can say it. That's the reason why I smoke so much pot. But I did say that, didn't I? We'll talk about the other reasons.
Because of what? Getting lost in your thoughts?
Well, anxiety.
Yeah.
I don't mind getting lost in my thoughts with pot, because I have like this constant barrage of thoughts that if I have a relationship with cannabis, and I don't smoke indica that much, it's more of a hybrid. Everything's a hybrid at this point, right? Everything slows down just enough so I can grab those thoughts and have a relationship with them, and throw them away if I need to. But that's why I haven't. I think that's why a lot of people do. But the sitting and dwelling in your thoughts trip isn't everybody's cup of tea. I totally get that.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, do you have any kind of, it sounds like the physical part of it is an intentional use of your cannabis, but is there utility? Otherwise, do you ever intentionally smoke it with a goal in mind?
I have, yeah. I have smoked and tried to journal, and it's worked. But ultimately, like, I get into like my flow state is writing, like when I'm really there, like that's an altered state by itself. And so really like the way you were talking about the gym, I think is so inspiring, because so much, I'm just such a cerebral person that if I can do something that's going to get me to like get out of my head and into my body, like that is what I need. And so if it's like smoke weed and then, dance, go to whatever. I mean, I guess in the pandemic, like I haven't been, to so many dance clubs recently, but like
Florida.
Before, what was that?
You go to Florida.
Florida, yeah, I could go. I mean, I do not like Florida that much, but I have a lot of thoughts on Florida. But yeah, I'd say like the intentionality there is really like to do something physical and social. I mean, but for psychedelics too, I think I have like a better practice around it. Especially, I think I have a better relationship, honestly, to like drugs like MDMA or psilocybin than I do with cannabis. I wouldn't say cannabis is like my favorite experience. And for that, again, like I really will like journal beforehand, or like set up a situation where I have like this music playing, or I have this book around, or I have my hula hoop or something like that, and just curate the experience and, know what I'm trying to focus on for that session, whether it's like, even if it's like, it's a nice like Saturday afternoon and I'm going to just like, I'm going to intentionalize having a good time. And so, so often people think the intention has to be like, I'm going to work on trauma, or I'm going to like talk about my relationship with my mother. And I've done that stuff too. But sometimes when you commit to having a good time and then you fight through the discomfort and the anxiety that comes up, and you then choose to go with like the thought process and the approach that is going to engender a decent time, like that is a spiritual practice for me, because so often you can get stuck in negativity, and like you can get stuck in these like thought loops and anxiety spirals, and you're like, I'm not having a good time, like fuck it, I'm having a bad trip right now, like I don't even want to deal with this. And so for me, it's like deal with it, and deal with it in joy, in positivity.
Yeah. I think your practice of just like getting rid of the stuff, or getting above it, can be as satisfying as I'm pursuing this super high good time. I during quarantine, I really made a point. Well, I didn't make the point of the total, but it ended up being about 4 or 5 times that I tripped, because I knew I was getting into really uncomfortable, not even uncomfortable, but damaging places of solitude. My theory after all of this has been done, more or less, is that not having each other really made us a little crazy. That was the thing that made us crazy. We need the human interaction. But those 4 times, I think not only did I kind of keep my mind, but I had some real breakthroughs. And that was why I feel really strong right now. My psilocybin and hallucinogenic usage, rare that it may be, is also part of like my yoga practice. I don't do the two together, but I definitely relate the two. And ironically, I was in a digital yoga class and I was really having a hard time breathing because the air was so bad last summer, and I was up north. I told the instructor, I thanked her because she was helping me with these breathing techniques. And I said, yeah, you really helped me learn how to breathe. And she said, oh, it was like this some Black Lives Matter thing. I was like, no, literally, this is just literally helping me breathe. Sometimes people are a little too much. I was up in Oregon. You know how white Oregon is.
Yeah.
Kids are literally stopping to wave across the street. They haven't seen a Black pedestrian in their lifetimes.
Oh, wow.
But, it's better that way than the other way, I suppose.
Right.
Anyway.
The opposite. Yeah. What was that?
I was just going to say that, I was going to say I cured myself. I maintained, but the great thing about these drugs, no matter how you want to talk about, overseeing the distribution of them, is that they, different from pharmaceuticals, they can always offer you something more than the so-called cure. There's always like a different door or options that hadn't been imagined. And I think that's something you can call mystical or divine.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's not so much, they'll say in like the psychedelic space, like the journey is the medicine. And, that's why it's so controversial, especially you hear about a lot of companies now that are basically trying to like distill psychedelics into like a pill, and you don't even necessarily have to go through the whole grueling journey of it or trip or whatever. It's like taking the trip out of the tripping. And, the more psychedelic diehards will be like, no, that's not the point. Like, and so the question becomes like, is this just like, is the after effect of your brain chemistry what we're going for? Or is it like the lessons and the experience of going through discomfort or joy or euphoria or, just like the experience, the nausea even of, getting through a psilocybin trip, which sometimes happens for a lot of people. That's part of it. And I think becomes a metaphor for so much else. I always say, like life itself is like a big trip, and like tripping itself is like a microcosm of bigger things. I often feel. And so, I think there's something to being able to be here now, even when the here and now is not comfortable.
Mm-hmm. My be here now, my personal version of it, stole it from a pavement record, is between here and there is better than either here or there. And, because destinations can disappoint sometimes.
Right.
But if you're in that moment, it's a real thing. And I was thinking about that in terms of your question about how I consume. I don't eat edibles except at the gym. And then I kind of have a relationship between whatever organic energy drink I'm using and whatever caffeine I'm using. But where was I going with that? I don't generally like to have a certain level of cannabis in me. I like the going up and I like the coming down. I physically enjoy the going up, and then I'm very dialed in on the coming down, Mm-hmm. And the idea of, I've used tinctures and I've used edibles and all those things, but it's never as much of a satisfying experience, unless I get that trip of it.
Do you, just in terms of like the trip itself, or like that kind of, what am I getting at here? Like, how I guess, being on the Be Here Now network, like, how, have you personally like been influenced by Ram Dass's teachings or by this concept of Be Here Now? And like, how does that relate to getting through or experiencing like an altered state or some sort of substance?
I've known who he is since college, and Timothy Leary and those people. I put them in that class of people that shaped our psychedelic experience, our understanding, and then obviously things like yoga too that I'm very fond of, but I don't know his work that well. I've listened to audiobooks and car rides, I would say. I would say that I have generally received most of him through the extraordinary yoga teachers that I've had.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically during quarantine, there were little adages and things that carried you through, My ex-wife was super crunchy, and we slept outside when Jerry Garcia died, and in San Francisco we slept in the park. That's how crunchy it was.
That sounds really fun, actually. Wow.
Yeah, it was great. It was unforgettable. I wouldn't have gone on my own, that's for sure. I would never have gone, but I'm glad I did. But she introduced me to a lot of people. We met in Chico, and we met in Chico, and she worked in Paradise. And up in Paradise, that's the town that burned down,
Mm-hmm.
2 years ago. There was a woman named Bev Kim who did hypnotherapy through massage. And, she just had a world that most people are never going to have access to. That's the thing about being in our bubbles, that this was just a world most people, they'll get like a second or third generation of the really pure California experience. But I'll never take it for granted. I'm from fucking Ohio, dude. But that experience brought so much more. There's this the first yoga class I went to was a place called Harbin Hot Springs.
Oh, I know Harbin.
You know Harbin? Yeah.
Of course,
so the clothing optional place.
I didn't know that when I first went there.
Oh my God.
It was fine.
My child is he's always kind of embarrassed about it, but we have a picture of him there, and he's in a diaper and the only one. But I saw fried green tomatoes there on shrooms, and it just blew my mind. Or an LSD, and it just blew my mind. But I took a yoga class, and it didn't quite stick with me. It didn't take, But over the years, it's been something that's blossomed and blossomed and blossomed. And, through this deadline that I keep referring back to, I've been kind of neglecting it. And I'm a different person. I feel like 10 years older. And people don't usually come on and talk about how they're neglecting their mindfulness practice, but that's kind of happening with me. And, they always say you need it. You don't want to do it when you most need it. And I'm kind of in that spot right now. As soon as I turn in all my junk, I'm going to try to be a human being again.
I mean, it's really hard. And I think that's so much of it is like, I was just having this conversation with someone else I interviewed recently. And we were talking about how you check off the boxes. It's like these benchmarks or milestones of like, the job, the house, like, the relationship or whatever. And you think about like, even as a journalist, right? It's like, I have this deadline. I have to do X, Y, and Z this week, interview this person, finish this story, edit that story. And then applying the same mental approach, like the same mentality to your mindfulness practice, like checking off, like, did I meditate today? Did I do my breathing exercise? Did I do my yoga? And it's like, I don't want to have that checklist relationship to the thing that is feeding my soul.
Well, I'm going to give you the old person's lecture here.
Please, I need it because I'm. It's not working anyways. I'm not meditating for the 25 minutes I was supposed to every day.
And when I say I've let it go, I still do a half hour every other day. There's a half hour routine I do every other day.
So you're letting it go is not is a different definition.
Well, here's the deal. I see everything through a sports paradigm. I'm not going to make you talk about baseball again, but there was a pitcher named Oral Hershiser who, when he was 37, was still pitching. And I was like 29 when I heard him talk about it. And I was like, how can he still pitch? And he said he stretches for 2 hours a day. I said, 2 hours a day? And I remember having that as an ideal. And, you have to be rich to be able to stretch for 2 hours a day. But I do it. And when you have the luxury of being able to do that now, I think like as your body and your mind ages, you just have to make sure you do that stuff. Having a list approach doesn't have to be dogmatic. One of the most important parts of my ability to consume pot that we haven't talked about is a simple app that my girlfriend bought me in Portland, because I had a very great intuitive girlfriend and she understood that I was smoking a lot of pot and I needed this thing. It does go off. There's a list that beeps when I haven't done my things, but it has enabled me to do so much more. My point of my story is listing things aren't bad. I mean, you do it when you buy great things you want at the grocery store, don't you?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's just more like, how can you, listing things like, how can you integrate it in a way that feels like you naturally want to do it versus like you're making yourself and you know you have this list of things to do and you check it off, you know?
Yeah. I don't have the answer for that.
You don't
Nor
have the answer to it, yeah.
I would have sent my piece already.
Yeah. No, it's this, I mean, it's not a struggle. It's just like, it's part of the process of, I think, developing a relationship to these practices to the point where maybe they'll become second nature.
This is what you're talking about when you're talking about taking the capsules as opposed to the whole, mushroom. It is similar. You have to go through it. You have to go through the part where you actually want to do these things naturally. It's just part of the journey. It just doesn't feel. It's work. It's just hidden work. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, anyways, I mean, so is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you didn't get to discuss that you want to add,
I think it's interesting to come onto a podcast like this and talk like you have your things together, because no one really does. And, at risk of belaboring it, it's just the journey. But I see this world happening where cannabis is becoming normal. I've been there long enough that I relish the days when it was new and I was sneaking around, but I also am smart enough to know, it was also 14%, most of it was swag. Not the percents to dictate how high you get, but I didn't get that high. Sometimes you would buy the weed and not get high. Mm-hmm. I feel lucky to be here, and I feel like people like us who can openly talk about it benefit so much, because there's so many questions that it provokes. The gift of cannabis, and I think to an extent hallucinogens, is that they do provoke the right questions, and we get to contend with it. I'm really excited for the rest of the world to stop having it stick up its ass and really and enjoy this stuff. But I'm also enough of a dad to know that we have to do this in a way that's not just equitable, as we've been talking about so much, but beneficial in the health sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so much of it is also like integrating the lessons of cannabis and psychedelics into the way that we're operating, so it's beyond just like referential of the plant or of the psychedelic medicine, but then like, how are we like creating a society or creating, different sorts of industries that are reflective of, the values and insights that you come to, and I think that's really where practice comes in, right? Like you have your trip, you smoke weed, whatever, but then it's like, how can you harness that, that mental state and that awareness, whether it's through meditation or through, exercise or whatever, that it just becomes second nature and isn't necessarily like they don't necessarily need to return always to weed or to tripping to remember that and know how to like move forward in the world with that awareness.
Have you been made aware of any organizations or companies that have been good at downloading the experience? I've met some people at conferences who talked about it, but I've never actually been to anyone.
What do you mean downloading the experience?
Well, when we talk about having our trips and taking what we've learned from our trips into our lives in a way that's sustainable. Mm-hmm. Are you aware of those? I know a therapist up in Oregon who's talking about it, but I don't actually know people who are doing it.
I know of an app, which is, for me, feels a little bit antithetical. Just, I don't want to be on my phone when I'm tripping. Right. But the app essentially is like, what are your intentions? Then it like gives you like music while you're tripping. And then afterward, there's journal prompts and like ways for you to, to integrate it, or at least remember it. But, I think this goes beyond an app. It goes beyond what an external thing can do for you. Like this really is, there's no way to sort of bypass the human process of just tuning in, and like that's really hard work. I mean, honestly, like I'm doing like, I think there's different therapy practices you can do, even like EMDR, inner child things, or things where you're like really tuning into your body in a somatic way that enables you to internally change. I think it's going to come from an internal space.
My socialist utopia, we'll all get someone to help us that next day, talk it through, and download the experience. But I don't think we're having that immediately. I think that's the unfortunate thing about the industry consolidating so much and becoming so corporate at a time when we're having real breakthroughs and understanding. The sort of what I call socialist utopia isn't really inclined to happen. It's just not on the top of anybody's list right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's not, but you would think like with the way the pandemic has gone and people saying, oh, we need a change. The system has to change. The pandemic is showing that. I'd love to see the change. So
people may be saying that, but people don't have the power.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we do, but
the collective has the power, I think, is really what it's at. Yeah. So anyways, thank you so much for talking with me. How can people find you, find your work, learn about what you're doing online?
Well, I'm on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at Donnie Shell. I write where I can, when I can. I think I'm going to be ghosting a book very soon.
Great.
I might be out of the loop for a minute, but look forward to the series. The Center for Health Journalism is putting it out, and Capital in Maine is the publication that will actually initially put it into print, put it on the web. Cool.
Well, thank you so much. And yeah, I'm really excited for the work that you're doing, especially with the fairness in cannabis. And, I think there's more to talk about there.
Great. Well, really good talking to you. There's always so much to talk about.
Yeah, same. Bye.